The King of the United Kingdom will not close this chapter of his reign on his own terms, and the woman standing closest to him has now confirmed what the palace spent months refusing to say aloud. It did not break because of illness alone. It broke because of a decision made behind a closed oak door. A decision the Queen was asked to carry in silence until the machinery of the crown could no longer hold its shape around it. What the public was told was a season of rest. What those inside the walls understood was something far graver. A slow narrowing of the king's final working days into a corridor of protected hours, guarded diaries, and quiet farewells arranged with the precision of a state document. For Camilla, the confirmation was not a headline. It was the moment the private grief she had been asked to hold as duty crossed into the public record. And once it crossed, it could not be pulled back. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room in which she spoke was not a stage. It was a small sitting room on the garden side of a royal residence, the kind of room that holds no cameras and remembers no press. A single lamp burned against the late afternoon light. A folder sat unopened on the low table between two chairs. On the mantel, a framed photograph had been turned slightly outward, as if it had been consulted and then left facing the room. Camilla did not sit as a consort that afternoon. She sat as a wife who had rehearsed a sentence for weeks and now had to place it into the world. Her hands rested flat on the arm of the chair, not folded, not fidgeting, simply steady in the way a person becomes steady only after they have already wept in private. That mattered because, in royal grammar, stillness is a form of speech, and stillness in the Queen's hands is a signal, read by every senior official in the household. When she finally lifted her eyes to the aide across from her, she did not say the word that everyone feared. She said the word that made the fear real. She said quietly that the king's remaining working days were to be counted, and that the counting had already begun. For the private secretary in the chair opposite, the sentence did not arrive as news. It arrived as confirmation of a suspicion he had carried for months in the margins of his diary. He had watched the king's schedule thin from a forest of engagements into a careful garden of only the most necessary appearances. He had noticed that certain long-standing patrons had been quietly informed that visits would not be renewed. He had felt, without ever being told, the slow retraction of a monarch's public life into a smaller and smaller room. That mattered because private secretaries in the British system are, in simple terms, the invisible architects of a sovereign's time, and when their diaries begin to empty, the meaning of that emptiness is never accidental. He said nothing when the Queen finished. He only reached for the folder, opened it to the first page, and set his pen down beside it. The gesture was small. Its weight was enormous. For the household chaplain, called into a separate room an hour later, the news landed differently. He had known the king for decades, long before the crown, back when the man in question was still a prince navigating a life shaped more by expectation than by choice. He heard the Queen's words and did not respond with theology. He responded with memory. He thought of a garden at Highgrove, of a young man kneeling to inspect a hedge, of laughter that had not yet learned to be careful. That mattered because, for those who had known Charles before he was king, the confirmation of his final days was not the end of a reign. It was the end of a friendship they had all agreed, long ago, to share with a nation. For the Prince of Wales, informed by secure line from a room in Windsor, the moment refracted through a different lens entirely. He did not weep. He did not speak for a long time. He looked at the desk in front of him, at the leather blotter, at the fountain pen his father had given him on the day of his investiture, and he understood, with the sudden clarity of a man who has been rehearsing this understanding for years, that the reluctant successors was no longer reluctant, only unready. He asked one question. He was given one answer. He said simply that he would come. That mattered because in the coded language of the royal household, the word come, spoken by an heir in that tone, is not a plan. It is a preparation. For the Princess Royal, reached in a different corridor of the same day, the reaction was the steadiest of all. She had always been cast, without ever asking for the role, as the family's steady stabilizer, the sibling who arrived first and left last, the one who did not require the ceremony of grief to perform its duties. She heard the news and immediately asked what needed to be done. Not tomorrow, but that evening. That mattered because in every royal generation, there is one figure whose response to catastrophe is not emotion but logistics, and it is that figure who ensures the institution survives the private hour. To understand why this carried such force, the story must return to a dinner held nearly a year earlier, in a private dining room whose windows faced an inner courtyard rather than the world. The table had been set for 6, only 4 had arrived. The king had entered late, apologized without explaining, and taken his seat at the head with the careful economy of movement that those closest to him had already begun to notice. The soup was served. The conversation at first moved along the safe corridors of family news, weather, and the small architecture of daily life. Then, between the second and third course, the king set down his spoon and asked a question that none of the guests had expected. He asked, without preamble, what each of them believed a good ending looked like. That mattered because Charles, in the private grammar of his own family, had never been a man to speak of endings at a dinner table, and the question once asked could not be unasked. The room, according to a documented private account, did not answer immediately. The Queen looked at him for a long moment before returning her attention to her plate. The Prince of Wales, seated to his father's right, set his glass down with a precision that suggested he had been waiting for this conversation, without knowing he was waiting. The Princess Royal, seated opposite, said only that a good ending was one in which nothing important was left unsaid. The chaplain, invited that night as an old friend rather than as clergy, said that a good ending was one in which the person leaving was not asked to perform. The king listened to each answer. He did not offer his own. He returned to his soup. But the question, once released into the room, became the seed of every private decision that followed in the months to come. In the weeks after that dinner, small changes began to appear in the machinery of the king's life. Changes so quiet that only those closest to the diary noticed them. A long-planned tour was postponed with a phrase about scheduling. A patronage was gently transferred to a younger family member with the language of continuity. A regular audience was moved from morning to afternoon, and then from afternoon to a shorter window entirely. That mattered because in the British constitutional system, the sovereign's diary is not merely a calendar. It is a document read by ministers, by ambassadors, by the heads of the armed forces, and any sustained retraction of that diary is understood, without ever being announced, as a shift in the center of gravity of the state. The confrontation, when it came, did not take place in a grand room. It took place in a corridor. The Prince of Wales had arrived at the residence for a scheduled meeting with his father and had been asked to wait. He waited for 11 minutes. When the door finally opened, it was not his father who stepped out, but the king's senior physician, who inclined his head, said nothing, and continued down the corridor toward a smaller office. The prince entered. His father was standing at the window with his back to the door. The light was behind him, so that when he turned, his face was in shadow. Neither man spoke for what felt, to those who later reconstructed the moment, like a full half-minute. Then the king said, without turning fully into the light, that he was sorry. That mattered because in the private vocabulary of a father who had spent a lifetime withholding softness in the name of duty, the word sorry, spoken first and unprompted, was not an apology for anything specific. It was an admission that time had become finite. The prince did not ask what his father was sorry for. He did not need to. He crossed the room, and for the first time in many years, the two men stood close enough that the difference in their heights no longer seemed like a matter of posture, but a matter of years. The king placed a hand on his son's shoulder. He said quietly that the work would continue. The prince said quietly that he understood. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of every conversation the two of them had failed to have across 4 decades. And it was in that silence that the transfer of the reluctant successor's reluctance into resolve finally, invisibly, occurred. In the days after that corridor meeting, the physical machinery of the royal household began to shift in ways that only those who worked inside it could read. A red dispatch box, which in simple terms is the leather-bound container in which state papers travel from ministers to the sovereign, began to be delivered later in the day and returned earlier the next morning, its contents lighter, its urgency filtered by hands other than the king's. A second chair, long positioned beside the king's desk for private audiences, was quietly moved to a corner of the room. A schedule board in the private office, which had displayed the king's engagements 6 months out, now displayed only 3. That mattered because objects in a royal residence are never merely objects. They are the physical grammar of power, and when they move, the sentence of the state is being rewritten. A folder marked with the king's personal cipher was placed on the desk of the private secretary and left there for 2 full days before it was opened. When it was finally opened, it contained a single sheet of instructions, handwritten, in the king's own script. The instructions were not about succession, they were about music. They specified which hymns were to be sung, which readings were to be chosen, which flowers were to be excluded, and which small kindnesses were to be shown to those who had served the household longest. The private secretary read the sheet twice. He then placed it back in the folder, closed the folder, and set it in the locked drawer to his right. He did not speak of it to anyone for a full week. That mattered because in the household, the arrival of such a document is not a rumor. It is an instrument of state. The second warning came from a direction no one had prepared for. A routine medical review, scheduled quietly for a Tuesday morning, produced a result that required a second review the same afternoon. The second review produced a conversation that lasted 40 minutes behind a closed door. When the door opened, the king emerged first. He did not look at the physicians. He looked at the queen, who had been waiting in a chair by the window, and he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. She rose. She did not ask a question. She simply walked with him back to the private apartments in a silence that the household staff, watching from a respectful distance, would later describe as the most eloquent silence they had ever witnessed. That mattered because in the choreography of a royal marriage under strain, the absence of words is often the most accurate translation of the truth. That evening, the queen sat alone in the sitting room she used for correspondence. She did not write. She looked at the fire for a long time. On the table beside her sat a small worn book of poetry, given to her by the king in the earliest years of their private friendship. Long before the marriage, long before the crown, back when the two of them were simply two people who had found in each other a shelter from the noise of their respective lives. She opened the book. She did not read it. She held it. That mattered because for Camilla, who had spent decades being cast by the public in every role except the one she had actually lived, the book was the only object in the residence that remembered her, not as consort, not as duchess of anything, but as the woman a young Charles had once written to in a hand that trembled slightly at the edges of the letters. When the king came into the room, he did not turn on the overhead light. He sat down opposite her. He did not reach for the book. He reached instead for her hand. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then he said, in a voice stripped entirely of the register he used for the state, that he did not want her to be afraid. She said, in a voice equally stripped, that she was not afraid of what was coming. She was afraid of what came after. He understood exactly what she meant. She was not speaking of grief. She was speaking of the years in which she would have to continue being a public figure without the private person who had made the public role bearable. He held her hand more tightly. He did not promise anything he could not deliver. He said only that she had been braver than anyone had ever given her credit for, and that when the time came, she would be braver still. That mattered because in that small exchange, two people who had spent the entirety of their public lives being interpreted by others finally interpreted each other in a room where no one else was listening. In the days that followed, the confirmation began to move outward, not as an announcement, but as a series of quiet adjustments that observers of the institution learned to read the way sailors read the sky. A long-scheduled overseas visit was reassigned to the Prince of Wales without public explanation. A ceremonial appearance at a regimental event was undertaken by the Princess Royal with a warmth that suggested she was standing in for more than her brother. A charity to which the king had been devoted for 4 decades received a letter from the private secretary requesting that future correspondence be directed, for the time being, to a designated deputy. That mattered because each of these small redirections was, in the language of the household, a card being quietly removed from the king's diary, and each removed card was a farewell that would never be spoken aloud. Outside the walls, the public began to sense what had not yet been said. It began, as these things always begin, in the small details. A photographer noted that the king had not been seen at a window in 9 days. A journalist noted that a scheduled walkabout had been reframed as a private meeting. A commentator observed, in a carefully worded column, that the rhythm of the palace's press releases had changed, that the verbs had become softer, that the future tense had begun to yield ground to the present. None of this was proof. All of it was pattern. And in a country whose relationship to its monarchy is built on the reading of patterns, the pattern itself became the story. When Camilla finally spoke, she did not speak to a camera. She spoke, according to a recorded internal note, to a small gathering of senior household staff assembled in a room that had once been used for morning briefings. She thanked them for their service. She thanked them for their discretion. She then confirmed, in a sentence that had clearly been written and rewritten many times before it was delivered, that the king's final working days were being carefully managed, that his wishes were being honored, and that the family was grateful, beyond the reach of any public statement, for the quiet dignity with which those inside the walls had carried a truth they had not been permitted to share. She did not cry. She did not hesitate. She finished her remarks, thanked them again, and left the room. The staff remained standing for several seconds after she had gone. That mattered because in the household, the moment a consort speaks such a sentence aloud is the moment the private grief of a family becomes the operational reality of a state. The news, once it left that room, moved through the institution with the speed of something that had been waiting a long time to move. Government offices were informed through the appropriate channels. Senior clergy were briefed in language chosen for care rather than for drama. Foreign courts, in a gesture older than any modern protocol, were sent quiet notes through their ambassadors. Broadcasters who had prepared for this possibility for years in the archives of their newsrooms began, without announcing it, to review the material they had long held in reserve. That mattered because the modern British state, for all its noise, still knows how to fall silent in the correct order, and the order in which it falls silent is itself a form of ceremony. Outside the gates, the public reaction gathered slowly, then all at once. A small crowd assembled at the railings of a residence that had not, technically, made any announcement. They brought flowers, though no one had asked them to. They brought handwritten notes, folded and tucked into the bars of the fence. They stood in a silence that was not organized and yet moved as if it had been rehearsed. One woman, interviewed briefly by a broadcaster who had approached her with visible reluctance, said only that she had come because her mother had once curtsied to a queen, and she wanted her daughter to remember what it had felt like to stand in the presence of a certain kind of century. She did not say more. She did not need to. That mattered because in that single sentence, the private grief of a family and the public grief of a nation found a shared language, and the language was inheritance. By the following morning, a newspaper front page carried a single photograph of the king, taken years earlier, walking alone through a garden he had designed with his own hands. The headline above it consisted of 3 words. The words were chosen with the restraint of an institution that understood the weight of what it was doing. Beneath the photograph, a single line of text observed that a reign, in the end, is measured not by the length of its days, but by the quality of the silences it leaves behind. That mattered because in a media landscape trained to shout, the choice to whisper was itself a statement, and the statement was received in every kitchen, every corner shop, and every quiet office in the country. A senior broadcaster, opening the evening bulletin, did not begin with the customary formalities. He began with a pause. He then said, in a voice pitched carefully below the register of drama, that the country was entering a season for which no rehearsal had ever been sufficient, and that the family at the center of that season had asked, through the quietest of channels, for the grace of privacy in the days ahead. He did not speculate. He did not embellish. He simply named, in the plainest possible words, the shape of what was coming. That mattered because in a country whose broadcasters have long served as the informal chaplains of its public life, the tone of a single sentence at 7 minutes past 6 in the evening can settle a nation's shoulders, and this sentence did. Inside the residence, the king spent the following morning in the small study that overlooked the garden. He did not work. He did not read. He sat in the chair he had used for 4 decades and watched a robin move along the low wall at the edge of the lawn. The queen came in briefly, placed a cup of tea beside him, and left without speaking. The Prince of Wales arrived at midday and remained until the light began to fall. The Princess Royal called from a train and spoke to her brother for 11 minutes. The chaplain, who had known the king since before either of them had understood what their lives were going to require of them, arrived in the late afternoon and stayed until the king, without saying so, indicated that he wished to be alone. That mattered because in the final architecture of a life lived in public, the private hours are the only hours that belong to the person living them. And these hours, at last, were his. In the private apartments that evening, the queen sat again with the small book of poetry. She did not open it. She placed it on the table beside the chair the king had used earlier in the day. She turned off all the lamps except one. She sat in the low light for a long time. When she finally rose, she did not put the book away. She left it where she had placed it, so that when the king returned, he would find it waiting, in the same room, at the same hour, in the same silence, in which their private life had been conducted for the whole of the years they had been given. That mattered because in the geography of a marriage, certain objects, placed in certain rooms, at certain hours, become the only monuments a couple ever needs. The confirmation that Camilla had delivered did not end the story. It began the final movement of it. In the days that followed, the machinery of the state continued its quiet work. The dispatch boxes grew lighter. The schedule board grew shorter. The second chair remained in the corner. The folder in the locked drawer was joined by a second folder, and then a third. The Prince of Wales began to appear at engagements with the composure of a man who had at last accepted the shape of the role he had spent his life preparing to inherit without wishing to. The Princess Royal continued to arrive first and leave last. The chaplain continued to visit without being asked. The Queen continued to sit, each evening, in the small sitting room with the single lamp, holding the book she did not need to open. Outside, the country moved through its ordinary days with a new awareness humming quietly beneath the surface. The awareness that comes when a nation understands, without being told, that it is living through the closing pages of a chapter it will one day describe to its grandchildren. Trains ran on time, markets opened and closed, children went to school. But at certain hours, in certain streets, people paused for reasons they could not entirely explain. And in those pauses, the private grief of a family and the public tenderness of a country met, briefly, without ceremony, and parted again. For those inside the walls, the days took on the quality of a long, slow exhalation. There were no dramatic scenes. There were no shouted arguments. There were no last-minute reversals. There was only the careful, deliberate work of honoring a man's final wishes with the precision he had spent his whole life bringing to the honoring of others. The king had asked, without ever asking, for an ending that did not require him to perform. The family, the household, and the institution had agreed, without ever agreeing aloud, to give him one. Camilla, in the days after her quiet confirmation, took on a role that the public had not yet learned to see. She was not merely the consort. She was the keeper of the room in which the king was permitted, at last, to be a private person. She guarded the hours. She managed the visitors. She said, without saying it, who would be admitted and who would be gently deferred. She did this without visible strain and without visible sentiment, because she had understood, long before anyone had told her, that the truest form of love available to her in that final season was the form that made no demands of the person she loved. That mattered because in the long history of royal marriages, there are few examples of a consort who understood with such clarity that the final gift she could offer her husband was the gift of not being watched. The Prince of Wales in those same days began to carry himself differently. It was not a matter of ceremony, it was a matter of interior weight. He spoke less. He listened more. He arrived at meetings early. He read documents twice. He asked the questions his father would have asked, and then he asked the questions his father would not have thought to ask. He was becoming, in real time, the sovereign he had never wanted to be. And he was doing so with the quiet grace of a son who had finally understood that the best way to honor a father is to become, at last, the man that father had always believed him capable of becoming. That mattered because in the transmission of a crown, the moment that transmission truly occurs is rarely the moment the world sees. It is the moment, weeks or months earlier, in which the heir stops being an heir and simply becomes. The Princess Royal continued to do what she had always done, which was everything that no one else remembered needed to be done. She wrote the notes. She made the calls. She sat with the staff who had served longest and let them speak of memories they had not been permitted to share. She was, as she had always been, the steady stabilizer, the sibling whose presence in a room lowered the temperature of every crisis. And in those final weeks, her presence became the quiet architecture on which the rest of the family, without ever saying so, learned to lean. The chaplain, who had known them all for longer than any of them cared to admit, moved between the rooms of the residence with the discretion of a man who understood that his role was not to speak, but to witness. He offered no sermons. He offered no counsel, unless asked. He simply was there, in the corners and the corridors, a steady presence whose steadiness was itself a form of grace. When the king asked him, one evening, whether he thought a life could be measured, he did not answer in the language of theology. He answered in the language of gardens. He said that a life, like a garden, is measured not by its size but by what continues to grow in it after the gardener has set down the shears. The king listened. He did not reply. He nodded once, slowly, and looked out the window at the light on the lawn. The country in those days held its breath in a way that only countries with long memories know how to hold their breath. Newspapers softened their tone. Broadcasters lowered their volume. Politicians of every party and every persuasion agreed, without needing to be told, that certain kinds of noise were to be set aside for a season. It was not that public life stopped. It was that public life, for a little while, remembered that it was made of private lives, and that at its center, at that particular moment, sat a private life that was drawing, with dignity, to its close. Camilla gave honesty. The Prince of Wales gave readiness. The Princess Royal gave steadiness. The chaplain gave presence. The household gave discretion. The country gave, in the end, the one thing it had always been capable of giving when it chose to remember its better nature. It gave grace. And the king, for his part, gave the only thing a sovereign can give in his final working days, which is the example of how to leave a room without asking the room to notice him leaving. He gave it quietly. He gave it completely. He gave it in the manner of a man who had spent his whole life preparing, without knowing he was preparing, for exactly this kind of exit. What Camilla confirmed, in that small sitting room on the garden side of the residence, was not simply that the king's final working days had begun to be counted. She confirmed that the counting was being done with care, that the wishes of the man at the center were being honored, that the family around him had chosen, without hesitation, to place his peace above their own, and that the institution, for all its ancient weight, had remembered how to bend around a single human life. She confirmed, in the end, that a reign can end the way it began, with a quiet man in a quiet room, doing the difficult work of being exactly who he had promised, decades earlier, that he would be. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.